There is a kaleidoscope of butterflies found in the Great Lakes region of Africa. This region that covers parts of East and Southern Africa is one of the only natural habitats of the Afrotropical Amauris butterflies. Within this genus is a species called the Amauris ochlea bumilleri lans. Butterflies of this species have beautiful dark brown wings speckled with white spots. Part of this butterfly species name, Bumilleri, was drawn from the name of the German who first collected them while on an expedition in 1893. His name was Theodor Bumiller. These butterflies were not the only thing that Bumiller collected during his time in Africa. Over the course of his stay on the continent, he obtained hundreds of objects which he took back to Germany, most of which are housed at the Reiss-Engelhorn Museen, or the REM in short. So, who was Theodor Bumiller? How did he obtain so many African objects? And how did they become a part of the REM's collection? Hello and welcome to A Trail of Artefacts. I am your host, Cheruto. In this podcast miniseries, we tell the stories of artifacts taken from the German Empire's former African colonies, the people who brought them to Mannheim city, and how these artifacts became a part of the REM's world collection. This podcast is a project by kulturweit tandems of the German Commission for UNESCO in cooperation with the Reiss-Engelhorn Museen. If you wish to listen to this podcast in German, click the link in the description for access to all our uploaded episodes. At some point in time, Theodor Bumiller was a sort of local celebrity in Mannheim city. He was only 7 years old when his family moved to Mannheim from a small town called Landstuhl in 1871. Bumiller's father had passed away 2 years prior, but had left his family financially well off after acquiring wealth in the sparkling wine and champagne business. This wealth afforded Bumiller several luxuries. The first of these luxuries was that he did not need a bread and butter job and could pursue his education undistracted. Bumiller attended universities in Heidelberg and Göttingen, studying general political science, politics, and constitutional and international law, and received his doctorate in 1886 when he was only 22 years old. The second luxury was travel. Just 1 year after completing his doctorate, Bumiller successfully made his first ascent on the Piz Palu in Switzerland. To this day, alpinists know this climb as the Bumiller Pillar. The third luxury was the social circle that he was a part of. Bumiller's financial situation improved even further in 1895 when he married Emilia Lanz, the daughter of the well-known Mannheim industrialist couple Heinrich and Julia Lanz. After tying the knot in a pompously staged wedding, Bumiller ascended into the first circles of the national, liberal, upper middle class in Mannheim. His education, his love for travel, his social status, and his military background from serving in the Prussian Garde du Corps made it possible for Bumiller to make his way to German East Africa in 1889 when he joined a campaign of conquest to the hinterland of present-day Tanzania. By this time, Africa had already been partitioned amongst Europe's powers, and the German Empire was enforcing its interests in its territories. This task was initially carried out by private companies such as the German East Africa Company. The company's attempts to gain more control in the region were met with fierce resistance from local coastal communities, resulting in an uprising called the Abushiri Revolt in 1888. Before the situation escalated, the German Reich Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had not wanted the direct involvement of German officials in the administration of this territory. But because of the instability, he felt it necessary to appoint an imperial commissioner who could bring control. This task was assumed by Hermann Wissmann. Wissmann then created a troop, aptly named the Wissmann-Truppe, to suppress the resistance. The Wissmann-Truppe was mostly made up of African soldiers and a few German officers, including Bumiller. Bumiller gained Wissmann's trust and became his right-hand man. As part of the Wissmann-Truppe, Bumiller traveled extensively in German East Africa, conducting conquests around the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro and Lake Nyassa. He kept diaries of the troops' activities during these conquests, diaries that were never published. Reports in these diaries paint a vivid and uncensored picture of the extent of the brutality with which African communities were treated. The burning of villages, the execution of chiefs, local massacres with machine guns, and thinly veiled threats shrouded as negotiations were part of the standard repertoire. One of the diary entries explicitly places Bumiller in the siege of the compound of Chief Sina of Kibosho near Kilimanjaro. These acts of violence were a means of anchoring colonial rule. While the brutality perpetrated by Wissmann and Bumiller was cause for concern by some individuals, it was mostly met with enthusiasm from supporters of Germany's colonial expansion. It's not a far-fetched idea to conclude that this positive public reception to Bumiller's conquest work in Africa lent to how he presented himself as a colonial hero. He kept up this reputation by not only staging the artifacts he had amassed from East Africa in his home, but also offering them for public exhibitions. In 1889, for example, Bumiller lent the Mannheimer Antiquity Society some of these artifacts. In the summer of 1894, there was another public exhibition of Bumiller's African artifacts. Another way through which he maintained the reputation of a colonial hero was by dressing up in his spotless white uniform and parading around the streets of Mannheim, accompanied by his black servant Silimu bin Abakari. Silimu came from the Comoros and had traveled with Bumiller for several years. Silimu played an integral role in the success of Bumiller's work by serving as a language aid and mediator. He also wrote travel reports that were translated into German, making him one of the few Africans with written and published work in Europe at the time. Because of his work in the state colonial and diplomatic service, Bumiller was stationed in different parts of the world between 1895 and 1903, from Tanzania to Germany to Egypt and France. His career ended in 1906 when he was involved in a colonial scandal. Tippelskirch, the company that supplied military equipment to the colonial administrators in German Southwest Africa, sold their equipment at an overpriced amount. One of the revelations of the investigations into these claims reveals that Bumiller was a silent partner in the company during the time that he worked in the colonial department of the Foreign Office. When this information came to light, he was forced to resign from the colonial state service. Things had been falling apart in Bumiller's personal life as well. He had squandered his fortune and a large portion of his wife's inheritance with his overindulgent lifestyle. This caused Emilia to be disinherited by her father in order to protect the family fortune. Then, in an unexpected turn of events, Hermann Wissmann, who had been an important point of orientation in Bumiller's life for several years, died in 1905 by a shot from his own gun during a hunt. After this sequence of events, Bumiller disappeared from the scene, only to resurface near Istanbul in 1912 during the Balkan War, where he died of a cholera infection at the age of 48. The reason for his presence in the war is not exactly known, although many accounts of his death at the time attribute it to his activity as a war correspondent. In 1920, Bumiller's widow Emilia gave his ethnographical collection of artifacts from Africa and Asia to the city of Mannheim. This happened at a time when Mannheim city was intent on establishing a colonial museum. Having such a collection would have been a visual indicator of the city's connection to Germany's colonies and its importance during this imperial era. Because Bumiller was a long-time resident of the city, his collection was an expression of this idea. When the Museum of Natural History and Ethnology was opened in 1925 in Mannheim, a special department was set up in Bumiller's honor. This museum later came to be part of the Reiss-Engelhorn Museen. After World War II, artifacts from the Bumiller collection were transferred to the depot and are no longer openly accessible to the public. Today, it is no longer possible to fully reconstruct the entire inventory of artifacts from Bumiller's collection. No lists were created at the time that Emilia Lanz handed the artifacts over to the city. Only a short time later, she sent the museum lists of artifacts from her husband's estate, which only provide information about a small part of the collection. The Reiss African collection comprises a total of 11,800 artifacts. Based on the entries in the inventory books kept from 1936 onwards, and index cards that were drawn up from the 1950s, it is highly probable that 1,330 of these artifacts belong to the Bumiller collection. Nonetheless, all descriptions of the Bumiller collection are only approximations due to the lack of information. About half of the African part of the Bumiller collection consists of weapons, most of them likely being spoils of war. This shows just how involved German military personnel were in building the collections of ethnological museums, and just how much conflict there was with local African communities. It's also important to remember that at the time that these conflicts were happening, weapons of European provenance such as rifles were in use by communities in East Africa. Yet, only traditional African weapons such as knives, daggers, swords, spears, shields, clubs, bows, and arrows were collected. In a sense, it is only objects that were perceived as primitive that were collected, objects that could be used to further the ideology that Africans were in need of civilization and salvation. Majority of the weapons from East Africa are of Maasai provenance. The Maasai are a community who live in East African areas in present-day Kenya and Tanzania. Once Maasai males become adults, they attained the status of warriors, known in their local language as Ilmoran or Moran in the anglicized term. The Maasai Morans were fierce defenders of their nomadic lifestyle, their pastoral lands, and their herds of cattle, all which were important elements of their culture. Constant conflict occurred between the Wissmann-Trooper and the Maasai Morans in the area south and southwest of Kilimanjaro, which was the settlement and grazing area of the Maasai. Entries in Bumiller's diaries describe some of these conflicts. It is highly likely that most of the Maasai artifacts were plundered in 1891 as the Wissmann-Trooper returned from a campaign of conquest. Wissmann ordered for indiscriminate attacks and murder of Maasais, destruction of their property, and looting of their cattle. Unsurprisingly, one of the shields in the Bumiller collection has a bullet hole from a rifle, making it one of the objects that bears the signs of colonial violence. A large number of baskets, fans, bowls, spoons, headdresses, belts, sandals, necklaces, and bracelets were also collected. Unlike most of the objects obtained in the context of war, one of the most impressive objects in the Bumiller collection was acquired as a gift. The object was an elephant tusk presented to Bumiller by the well-known East African ivory and slave trader Hamad bin Muhammad bin Juma Rajab El Murjebi, known as Tipu Tip. While this gift did not point to violence against African people, it does speak to the violence against African wildlife that still exists even today. In the decades after his death, Theodor Bumiller remained anchored to local memory in the region around Mannheim. Colonial and core student circles continued to glorify him as a colonial hero. He was still viewed in a benevolent light even after World War II, when most of the German people were re-evaluating harmful ideologies about supremacy. Anecdotes about him mentioned his cheekiness, his charm, his love for adventure, and his eccentricity. Even in 2012, an appreciation appeared in the Mannheimer Morgen on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of his death, where he was described as a legendary figure of all-surpassing greatness, a fame-seeking adventurer, and a daredevil. The existing Wikipedia entry that details aspects of his life, including his exploits as an alpinist and his participation in the so-called expeditions to German East Africa, only offers a sanitized account of who he was. In these accounts of who Bumiller was, the brutality with which he proceeded in German East Africa is omitted. All these are symptomatic of how Bumiller's colonial legacy is hidden and overlaid in the memory of him. This podcast miniseries is created by Lara and I, Cheruto. It is a project by Kulturweit tandems of the German Commission for UNESCO, produced in cooperation with the Reiss-Engelhorn Museen. Thank you for tuning in. You can join us for the next episode, where we talk about Franz and Marie-Paulina Thorbecke and a Trail of Artefacts from Cameroon.